The torchlight found her first. A pale beam, trembling in the hand of an electrician named Harold Batchelor, swept across the damp concrete floor of the air raid shelter on Montague Place, Marylebone, and there she lay, face upward, scarf wound tight around her throat, one breast exposed where the fabric of her blouse had been torn. Her shoes were scuffed at the heels as though she had been dragged or had tried in those last desperate seconds to find her footing on the cold ground. It was Sunday morning, the 9th of February 1942, and London had not yet finished with the night. Outside, the streets were still wrapped in the enforced darkness of the blackout, that suffocating veil drawn over the entire city to deny the Luftwaffe its targets. No street lamps burned. No light escaped from behind the painted windows of homes and factories. The war had made London blind, and in that blindness, something far older than German bombers had begun to move. The woman's handbag was missing. £80 gone. Her name was Evelyn Hamilton, and she was 40 years old, a pharmacist from the north, and she had been dead for only a few hours. The bruises on her throat told the story of strong hands, left-handed hands, and the silence of a city that could not see what was happening in its own shadows. She was the first. Within 4 days, there would be 3 more. Chapter 1. The City in Darkness. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, wherever you are, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. The world outside your window has grown still, or nearly so, and the hours ahead belong to no one but you and the dark. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. If you are new here, you have found a place where history is told the way it was once lived, slowly, softly, by the light of what little remains. If you've been here before, then you already know the way. Settle in. Let the weight of the day fall away. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Perhaps it is late and the house has gone quiet around you. Perhaps the rain is falling, or the wind has picked up, or the silence is so complete you can hear your own breathing. Wherever you are welcome here. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now would be a gentle moment to do so. It costs nothing, and it helps this small corner of the night continue to exist. A like, a subscription, a quiet word shared with someone who might also enjoy drifting through the past. These small kindnesses are the fuel that keeps the candle burning. And tonight, that candle will need to burn for a long while, because the story we are about to enter is one of the darkest London has ever known, and it unfolded not in the fog-bound alleyways of the Victorian age, but in the blacked-out streets of a city at war, in the freezing February of 1942. To understand what happened in those terrible 6 days, one must first understand the darkness itself. Not the metaphorical darkness of evil or depravity, though that too will come in time, but the literal, physical, absolute darkness that had been imposed upon the City of London since the 1st of September 1939, the very day that German forces crossed the border into Poland and the Second World War began. On that day, before the first shots had even been fired on British soil, the government enacted the blackout. It was a simple order, born of a simple fear. German bombers, it was understood, navigated at night by following the glow of cities beneath them. The lights of London, that vast electric constellation stretching from the Thames to the northern suburbs, would serve as a beacon to the Luftwaffe, a shining target painted across the landscape of southern England. And so the lights were extinguished. Every street lamp was switched off. Every window was covered with heavy black curtains, or painted over with dark paint, or sealed with thick paper and tape. The headlamps of motor cars were fitted with narrow slotted covers that allowed only the faintest sliver of light to escape. Traffic signals were hooded. Shop signs went dark. Even the striking of a match in the open air could draw sharp rebuke from an air raid precautions warden, those men and women who patrolled the streets each night to enforce the regulations. The penalty for allowing light to escape from a dwelling was a fine, and the wardens, armed with whistles and torches fitted with tissue paper filters, took their duties seriously. The glow of a cigarette, the brief flare of a lighter, the pale luminescence of a wristwatch dial held too high, all of these were violations, tiny fractures in the darkness that the wardens existed to seal. The effect upon London was immediate and profound. A city that had blazed with electric light since the late 19th century was suddenly plunged into a darkness its inhabitants had not known for generations. The great avenues of the West End, Piccadilly and Regent Street, and the Strand, which had glittered with theatre marquees and restaurant windows, and the warm amber glow of 1,000 lamps, became corridors of impenetrable black. pedestrians stumbled into one another on the pavements. They walked into lampposts, fell from curbs, stepped into the paths of vehicles they could not see, and whose drivers could not see them. In the first 4 months of the blackout, before the bombs had even begun to fall, the number of road fatalities in Britain doubled. People drowned in canals they could not see. They fell from railway platforms into the paths of trains running without lights. They broke ankles on steps and twisted knees on uneven ground and walked face first into walls. The darkness was not merely inconvenient. It was dangerous in its own right. A new and unfamiliar hazard layered atop all the other hazards of a nation at war. And yet it was accepted, because the alternative, the prospect of German bombs falling with unerring accuracy upon a brightly lit city, was understood to be worse. The blackout transformed more than the physical landscape of London. It transformed the moral landscape as well. In the darkness, the old social boundaries softened and blurred. The enforced intimacy of the shelters, those damp underground spaces where strangers pressed together during air raids, broke down the rigid class distinctions that had defined British life for centuries. A duchess might find herself seated beside a charwoman, a banker beside a dock worker, and in the long hours of waiting, as the ground shook and the dust sifted down from the ceiling, the usual formalities fell away. But the darkness also provided cover for those who sought to exploit it. Petty crimes surged. Looting became so prevalent that the government introduced severe penalties, including the possibility of the death sentence, for those caught stealing from bombed-out properties. Pickpockets thrived in the crowded shelters. Burglars operated with impunity on streets where no one could see them, and where the police, their ranks already depleted by conscription, could scarcely patrol. The black market flourished. Deserters from the armed forces vanished into the unlit maze of the city, and in the pubs and clubs of the West End, where servicemen on leave gathered to drink and forget, a particular kind of commerce continued as it had for centuries, largely unaltered by the war except in its increased desperation. The women who walked the streets of Soho and Piccadilly and Paddington in those years were not, for the most part, the theatrical figures of popular imagination. They were ordinary women, many of them driven to solicitation by circumstance. The war had displaced millions. Husbands were overseas or dead. Jobs that had sustained families in peacetime had vanished or been requisitioned for war production. The cost of living had risen sharply, while wages for those who could find work had not kept pace. Rationing, introduced in January of 1940, ensured that no one starved, but it did not cover rent or clothing or the small comforts that made life in a besieged city bearable. And so, in the blackout, women appeared on the darkened corners and in the doorways of the West End, offering companionship to soldiers and airmen and sailors who had money in their pockets and only a few days of leave before returning to the war. The transactions were brief and conducted in near total darkness. A whispered negotiation. A walk down an unlit alley or up a narrow staircase to a rented room. The exchange of a few pounds. The encounter itself, hurried and anonymous, and then the return to the darkness, each party disappearing into the Black City as though they had never existed. The police knew of this trade and, for the most part, tolerated it. There were larger concerns. The city was being bombed. The docks were burning. The dead were being pulled from the rubble every morning. The moral policing of private transactions between consenting adults was not a priority. But this tolerance, this collective turning of the blind eye, created a vulnerability that no one had foreseen. The women who worked the blackout streets were, by the nature of their occupation, exposed to precisely the kind of danger that the darkness amplified. They went willingly with strangers. They entered rooms and alleyways and shelters with men they had never seen before and would never see again. They had no protection, no recourse, and in many cases no one who would notice if they failed to return. A woman could vanish in the blackout, and the city, consumed by its own survival, might not register her absence for days. This was the world into which Gordon Frederick Cummins stepped in the first week of February 1942. A world of absolute darkness, of weakened policing, of vulnerable women, of a city so consumed by the external threat of annihilation that it had not considered the threat that might be walking among its own streets, wearing the uniform of a defender. The Blitz, that sustained campaign of aerial bombardment that had begun in September of 1940 and continued with devastating intensity through the spring of 1941, had by February of 1942 entered a new and intermittent phase. The worst of the bombing was over, or so it seemed. The Luftwaffe had turned its attention to the Eastern Front, where the invasion of the Soviet Union consumed the bulk of Germany's military resources. But London remained a target, and the raids continued, sporadic and unpredictable, enough to keep the blackout in force and the shelters in use and the city in a state of perpetual, exhausting vigilance. The people of London had endured 57 consecutive nights of bombing between September and November of 1940. They had sheltered in the underground stations, tens of thousands of them, sleeping on the platforms and in the tunnels. The sound of the explosions above them transmitted through the earth as a deep, shuddering vibration that rattled the teeth and loosened the plaster from the tiled walls. They had emerged each morning to find their city altered, sometimes beyond recognition. Entire streets had been reduced to rubble. Churches and hospitals and schools had been gutted by fire. The skyline of the city, that familiar silhouette of spires and chimneys and rooftops, had been rearranged by high explosive into something jagged and unfamiliar. And yet the city had continued. The buses ran. The shops opened, those that still stood. The postmen delivered the letters, stepping over the rubble and the fire hoses. The spirit of endurance that would later be mythologized as the Blitz spirit was, in reality, something quieter and more complicated. A mixture of genuine courage and simple exhaustion, of communal solidarity and private despair, of dark humour and darker fears that were never spoken aloud. By February of 1942, London was a city that had learned to live with death. Death from the sky, death from the sea, death from the battlefields of North Africa and the frozen steppes of Russia, where British allies were dying in numbers that defied comprehension. The casualty lists published in the newspapers each day were read with the grim familiarity of a weather report. The city's mortuaries were busy. Its cemeteries were filling. And in this atmosphere of normalized violence, in this city where the sound of an explosion in the night was no longer cause for alarm, but merely for a weary turning over in bed, the death of a single woman in an air raid shelter on a Sunday morning in Marylebone might easily have passed unnoticed. Might have been filed away as another casualty of the blackout, another unfortunate victim of the chaos that war had unleashed upon civilian life. And indeed, when the body of Evelyn Hamilton was discovered on the morning of the 9th of February, that is precisely what the Metropolitan Police initially believed. A robbery. A crime of opportunity. A woman alone in the dark, set upon by one of the countless petty criminals who prowled the blacked-out streets. There was nothing in those first hours to suggest that her death was the beginning of something far more terrible. But the darkness that had swallowed London was not merely a physical condition. It was a state of mind. The blackout had changed the way people moved through the city, the way they related to one another, the way they understood danger and safety. In the light, a city is knowable. Its streets have names and destinations. Its inhabitants have faces. In the darkness, all of that dissolves. The familiar becomes strange. The safe becomes uncertain. And the man walking beside you on the pavement, the man whose footsteps you can hear but whose face you can see, but whose face you cannot see, becomes not a fellow citizen, but an unknown quantity, a shape in the void, capable of anything. This was the London of February 1942, a city of 8 million souls wrapped in darkness, braced against the sky, and utterly unprepared for the horror that was about to unfold within its own streets. The bombs, at least, came from above, and there were sirens to announce their approach, and shelters to hide in, and a shared understanding that the enemy was out there, across the channel, identifiable and foreign. What London did not expect, what it could not have prepared for, was an enemy who wore the uniform of its own defenders, an enemy who spoke with an affected accent and bought drinks for women in West End pubs, and walked them home through streets so dark that no one could see what happened next. The Luftwaffe had given London the darkness, and in that darkness something else had begun to hunt. The Aircrew Receiving Centre at Regent's Park, where the Royal Air Force billeted its trainees and new recruits during the assessment period, stood within walking distance of the West End. It was a handsome building, requisitioned for the war effort like so many others, and in February of 1942 it housed approximately 300 airmen at various stages of their training. They slept in dormitories. They signed in and out of the billet each evening, their names recorded in a logbook maintained by a duty sergeant. The system was designed to account for their movements, but in practice it was porous. The logbook could be signed by a fellow airman on behalf of an absent comrade. A man could slip out after dark and return in the small hours without his absence being formally noted, provided he had a friend willing to scratch his name in the register. The centre was, in other words, both a barracks and a gateway. It gave its occupants a base in the heart of London, and the freedom, within the loose constraints of wartime discipline, to move through the city at will. For most of the young men billeted there, this freedom meant an evening at the cinema, or a few pints in a pub, or a dance at one of the halls that still operated despite the bombing. For one man among them it meant something else entirely. His name was Gordon Frederick Cummins, and he was 27 years old, and he had been posted to the receiving centre on the 2nd of February 1942, 7 days before Evelyn Hamilton was found dead in the air raid shelter on Montague Place. 7 days before the darkness of London acquired a new and terrible purpose. Chapter 2. The Count. Gordon Frederick Cummins was born on the 18th of February 1914 in the village of New Earswick in the North Riding of Yorkshire. It was a small, orderly settlement built by the Rowntree family for the workers of their chocolate factory, a model village of neat brick houses and tidy gardens arranged along quiet streets, the kind of place where respectability was not merely valued, but assumed. His father, John Cummins, was a civil servant who ran a school for delinquent youths, a man accustomed to discipline and to the correction of wayward boys. His mother, Amelia, born Amelia Lee, was a housewife who kept the home and raised 4 children, of whom Gordon was the eldest. There was nothing in the circumstances of his birth or his upbringing that would have suggested to anyone what he would become. The family was middle class, educated, respectable. The house was warm. The meals were regular. The expectations were clear. Gordon Cummins was privately educated, sent away to school in Llandovery in South Wales, where he received an education that was, by any measure, above the station his family's modest income might have suggested. He was a bright boy when he wished to be. He earned a diploma in chemistry at the age of 16. He was articulate, well-spoken, and possessed of an easy charm that made people inclined to like him before they knew him well enough to see beneath the surface. But there was something else in him, something restless and dissatisfied, a hunger for a life that did not match the one he had been given. And it was this hunger, more than any other quality, that would come to define him. After completing his schooling in 1930, Cummins enrolled at Northampton College of Technology. He was, by all accounts, a lackadaisical student. The discipline that had been imposed upon him at school did not survive the transition to a more independent setting. He attended lectures irregularly. He showed little interest in the work. He abandoned his studies on the 1st of November 1932, at the age of 18, and declared his intention to make his own way in the world. What followed was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the next several years, a pattern of brief employment, poor performance, and abrupt departure, always accompanied by the unshakable conviction that he was destined for something better. He moved to Newcastle and found work as an industrial chemist. He was dismissed after 5 months. Not for incompetence, but for laziness. A failure to apply himself to the routine demands of the position. In August of 1933 he obtained a job as a tanner in Northampton, working with leather in the old-fashioned way, scraping and treating hides in a trade that had not changed substantially in centuries. He was fired after 13 months, this time for poor timekeeping, an inability or unwillingness to arrive at his station when expected. There followed a period of casual labour, odd jobs taken and abandoned, a young man drifting through the early years of the Depression, without direction or purpose, sustained by the belief that the life he was living was merely temporary, a preamble to the grander existence that awaited him. It was in October of 1934 that Cummins relocated to London, and it was in London that the transformation began. He found work as a leather dresser in a clothing factory, earning £3 a week, a wage that was adequate but far from generous, enough to cover his rent and his meals and little else. He later trained to become a foreman at the same firm, a modest advancement that spoke to at least some capacity for sustained effort. But the city had awakened in him something that the quiet streets of New Earswick and the factories of Northampton had not. London was vast and anonymous, a place where a man could reinvent himself, where the past could be shed like an old coat and a new identity assumed with nothing more than a change of accent and a confident bearing. And this is precisely what Gordon Cummins set about doing. He began to cultivate the manners and speech of the upper classes. He refined his accent, smoothing out the flat vowels of Yorkshire, and replacing them with something that approximated the clipped, precise diction of the public schoolman. He dressed carefully, choosing his clothes with an attention to detail that exceeded both his income and his station. He told stories about his background that bore no relation to the truth, claiming connections to aristocratic families, hinting at noble blood, suggesting that his current circumstances were merely a temporary embarrassment, a gentleman fallen on hard times who would soon be restored to his rightful place. He spent money he did not have, running up debts and engaging in petty embezzlement to fund the lifestyle he believed he deserved. And when his employers discovered the discrepancies in the accounts, he was dismissed once more, cast out again into the streets of a city that was entirely indifferent to his pretensions. He moved into his brother's flat in Queen's Mews, Bayswater, and it was there, in the uncertain months of 1935, that he made the decision that would shape the remainder of his short life. In November of that year, Gordon Frederick Cummins volunteered to join the Royal Air Force. The reasons were practical, at least in part. The RAF offered steady pay, regular meals, accommodation, and a uniform, all of which were welcome to a man who had failed to hold down civilian employment. But there was something more. The RAF was, in the 1930s, the most glamorous of the armed services. Its pilots were the knights of the modern age, young men who flew above the clouds in machines of extraordinary speed and power, who danced with death in the thin air of the upper atmosphere and returned to Earth as heroes. The uniform itself carried a certain cachet, a suggestion of daring and distinction that the Army and the Navy, with their longer histories and more rigid hierarchies, could not quite match. For a man who craved admiration, who longed to be seen as something more than he was, the RAF was an irresistible proposition. It offered not merely a career, but an identity, a ready-made persona of courage and distinction that could be worn as easily as the blue-grey tunic. Cummins enlisted as a rigger, one of the ground crew responsible for the maintenance and repair of aircraft. It was not the glamorous role he had imagined for himself, not the pilot's seat with its leather helmet and silk scarf, but it was a start, and it came with the uniform. He was stationed at various bases across the country: Felixstowe, Helensburgh in Scotland, Cole in Wiltshire, and Lattle, Cornwall, moving through the system with the steady, unremarkable progress of a man who did just enough to avoid disciplinary action, but never enough to distinguish himself. His service record was clean but undistinguished. He was neither particularly good at his duties, nor particularly bad. He was, in the eyes of his superiors, simply one of thousands of young men in blue, filling the ranks, doing the work, waiting for the war that everyone knew was coming. But among his fellow airmen, Cummins was remembered for something else entirely. He had carried his aristocratic pretensions with him into the service. And in the close quarters of the barracks, where men lived and ate and slept in enforced proximity, his affectations did not go unnoticed. He spoke with an accent that was too polished, too precise, too carefully constructed. He told stories of noble connections and aristocratic relatives. He referred to himself, on occasion, as the Honourable Gordon Cummins, a title to which he had no claim whatsoever. His fellow airmen, possessed of the sharp instinct for fraudulence that is the particular gift of men forced to live together in confined spaces, saw through him almost immediately. They gave him a nickname. Some called him the Count, others called him the Duke. The names were not affectionate. They were barbed with mockery, a collective acknowledgment that the man in their midst was a pretender, a fantasist, a small-time fraud who believed his own stories with a conviction that was, depending on one's perspective, either pitiable or faintly alarming. Cummins appeared not to notice the ridicule, or if he noticed, he did not let it deter him. He continued to play the part, the aristocrat in exile, the gentleman in uniform, the man of breeding and distinction who had chosen to serve his country out of noble obligation rather than economic necessity. It was a performance, and like all performances, it required an audience. And London, when he returned to it, would provide him with one. On the 28th of December 1936, Gordon Cummins married a young woman named Marjorie Stevens at the Paddington Register Office. Marjorie worked as a secretary to a theatrical producer, a position that placed her on the fringes of London's entertainment world, a world of actors and directors and writers, of opening nights and stage doors and the particular brand of glamour that clung to the West End, even in the lean years of the late 30s. The marriage appeared from the outside to be stable. Marjorie was devoted to her husband. She believed, or appeared to believe, his stories of noble heritage. She accepted his accent, his manners, his expensive tastes, and if she noticed the gap between his aspirations and his achievements, she did not speak of it. The couple had no children. They lived modestly, their circumstances dictated by the irregular rhythms of military pay, and the occasional supplements that Cummins extracted from his various schemes and embezzlements. There was, in those early years of the marriage, no outward sign of violence. No police reports. No hospital visits. No whispered confidences to friends or family. Gordon Cummins, the Count, the Duke, the Honourable Pretender, was, to all appearances, a man whose principal failing was vanity, an annoying but ultimately harmless tendency to inflate his own importance. No one, least of all his wife, had any reason to suspect that beneath the polished surface something else was taking shape. The war, when it came in September of 1939, changed everything. It changed the country, of course. The whole vast machinery of national life wrenched from its peacetime track and redirected toward the single purpose of survival. But it also changed the individual lives of millions of men and women, disrupting the routines and relationships that had sustained them, exposing them to conditions of extremity that revealed aspects of their characters they had not known existed. For some, the war brought out reserves of courage and compassion that surprised even themselves. For others, it provided opportunities that peacetime would never have offered, chances to steal, to deceive, to exploit the chaos of a society in upheaval. And for a very few, a number so small as to be statistically insignificant but morally devastating, the war provided something else entirely. It provided cover. The darkness of the blackout, the anonymity of a city in flux, the distraction of a population consumed by its own survival, the constant grinding proximity of death which dulled the senses and blunted the capacity for shock. In such conditions, a man who wished to do harm could do so with a freedom that peacetime would never have permitted, and the war, with its vast appetite for destruction, would scarcely notice the addition of a few more bodies to its toll. Cummins remained in the RAF throughout the early years of the war, stationed at various bases, performing his duties with his usual air of bored competence. He had volunteered to retrain for aircrew duties, an ambition that spoke to his desire for advancement and, perhaps, to the romantic image of the pilot that had drawn him to the service in the first place. By the autumn of 1941, he had accrued over 1,000 hours of flight time and had been put forward for his aviation examination. He appeared before the RAF Selection Board and his performance was deemed satisfactory. In January of 1942, he was posted to the Aircrew Receiving Centre at Regent's Park in London, where he would undergo assessment and await assignment to an initial training wing. The intake was scheduled to run from the 2nd of February to the 25th, a period of approximately 3 weeks during which the airmen would be housed in the heart of the capital, free to come and go in the evenings, with little to occupy them beyond the routine assessments of the day and the vast, unlit expanse of the city at night. It was during this period, in October of 1941, while Cummins was still stationed at RAF Colan in Wiltshire, that 2 women were murdered in London under circumstances that would later attract the attention of Scotland Yard investigators. The first was a 19-year-old woman named Maple Churchyard, who was found strangled with her own undergarments on the 13th of October in the vicinity of Hampstead Road. The second, known in the records only as Mrs. Church, was found dead under similar circumstances 4 days later. Both women had been strangled. Both had been robbed. Both had been left in the darkness of the blackout. At the time, the murders were investigated as separate incidents, and no connection was established between them or to any specific suspect. London, in the autumn of 1941, was still reeling from the Blitz. Bodies were discovered with grim regularity in the rubble of bombed-out buildings. The resources of the Metropolitan Police were stretched to the breaking point. 2 dead women, in a city where death had become commonplace, did not trigger the kind of intensive investigation that might have been mounted in peacetime. But Cummins was known to have visited London frequently during his leaves from Colburn. He had lodgings in St. John's Wood. He had access to the West End. And Scotland Yard in the months that followed would come to believe that Maple Churchyard and Mrs. Church were his first victims, the earliest expressions of a violence that had been building inside him for years, waiting for the right conditions, the right darkness, the right city to set it free. By the time he arrived at the receiving centre in Regent's Park on the 2nd of February 1942, Gordon Cummins was 27 years old. He was handsome, well-built, articulate, and possessed of the kind of surface charm that could, in a brief encounter, pass for genuine warmth. He wore the uniform of the Royal Air Force. He spoke with an accent that suggested education and breeding. He was, to a woman meeting him for the first time in a dimly lit pub or a crowded club, exactly the kind of man one might trust. A serviceman, a gentleman, a man who bought drinks and made conversation and seemed, in all respects, perfectly safe. The uniform was his camouflage, more effective than any blackout curtain because it concealed not the light but the darkness within. And London, blind and weary and distracted by the bombs, did not see him coming. The receiving centre was a short walk from the streets where he would hunt. Soho to the south, Marylebone to the west, Piccadilly and the clubs of the West End, a pleasant stroll through the darkened streets. 300 men slept in the same building, and the logbook at the entrance was the only record of their comings and goings, a record that could be, and frequently was, falsified by comrades willing to sign in for an absent friend, in exchange for a cigarette or a drink. The system was built on trust, and trust, in wartime, was given freely. No one suspected that one of their own, one of the men in blue who were training to defend the nation, was preparing to tear it apart from the inside, one body at a time, in the darkness that was supposed to keep them all safe. The Count was in London, and the killing was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Pharmacist in the Shelter. The morning of Sunday, the 9th of February, 1942, was cold. A grey, damp cold, the kind that seeps through wool and settles in the bones, the kind that London produces in abundance during the long weeks between January and March, when the sun, if it appears at all, does so as a pale disk behind layers of cloud, so thick they seem to have weight. The streets of Marylebone were quiet. It was early, not yet light, and the blackout had not yet been lifted, though the dawn was close enough that the darkness had begun to thin at the edges, softening from absolute black to a deep, heavy grey. The air raid shelters that lined the streets, those squat concrete structures built to protect civilians from the bombs, stood empty now, or nearly so. The raids had been intermittent in recent weeks, and many Londoners had grown weary of the shelters, preferring the comfort of their own beds to the damp discomfort of a concrete box shared with strangers. But the shelters remained open, and in the darkness of the blackout they served other purposes as well. They were places where the homeless slept, places where courting couples sought privacy, places where, in the absence of light and observation, things could happen that would not have been possible in the open. It was an electrician named Harold Batchelor who found her. He had entered the shelter on Montague Place to check the lighting system, a routine task, part of the maintenance schedule that kept the shelters in a state of readiness for the next raid. His torch beam, a narrow cone of pale yellow light filtered through tissue paper to comply with blackout regulations, swept across the floor of the shelter and found, instead of the empty concrete he expected, the body of a woman. She was lying on her back. Her face was turned slightly to one side. A scarf was wound tightly around her head and neck, and the marks of strangulation were visible on her throat. Dark bruises that stood out against the pale skin like fingerprints pressed into wet clay. Her clothing was disordered. The blouse had been torn open, exposing one breast. Her shoes were scuffed, the heels scraped, suggesting either a struggle or the act of being dragged. Her handbag was missing. The torch lying nearby on the ground appeared to be hers. She had been dead for several hours. Batchelor summoned the police. The Metropolitan Police arrived within the hour, and with them came a man whose involvement would prove decisive in the days that followed. His name was Frederick Cherrill, and he held the rank of Chief Superintendent in the Metropolitan Police's Fingerprint Bureau at Scotland Yard, a position he had occupied since 1938. Cherrill was, by 1942, one of the foremost fingerprint experts in the world. He had spent decades refining the techniques of fingerprint identification, developing methods for lifting single prints from crime scenes, building the Bureau's records into a vast archive of thousands of catalogued impressions. He was known to his colleagues as the Fingerprint Man, a title he wore with quiet pride, and he insisted, as a matter of professional principle, on visiting crime scenes himself, rather than relying on the reports of subordinates. He brought with him a magnifying glass, a set of brushes, and the sharp, practiced eye of a man who had spent a career reading the invisible traces that human hands leave upon the surfaces of the world. Cherrill examined the body in the shelter on Montague Place, with the methodical care that was his hallmark. The woman had been strangled, that much was immediately clear. The bruises on her throat were consistent with manual strangulation, the application of sustained pressure by a pair of hands wrapped around the neck. The pattern of the bruising was notable. It suggested to Cherrill's experienced eye that the killer was left-handed, a detail that would acquire enormous significance in the days ahead, but that, for now, was simply filed away as one of the few scraps of evidence the scene had yielded. There were no fingerprints on the body that could be recovered. The shelter itself, a public space used by dozens of people each week, offered little in the way of useful forensic material. The woman's belongings were scattered nearby, her handbag among them, but the handbag had been rifled through, and its contents, including approximately £80 in cash, a substantial sum in wartime Britain, had been taken. The dead woman was identified through a process of door-to-door inquiry in the surrounding streets. Her name was Evelyn Margaret Hamilton. She was 40 years old, though some records would later list her age as 41. She was a pharmacist by profession, a qualified dispenser who had worked in the trade for many years. She was originally from the north of England and had most recently been employed as a manageress of a chemist's shop. She had recently lost that position and had secured new employment in Grimsby on the Lincolnshire coast. She was in London on the night of her death because she was travelling to her new post, breaking the journey with an overnight stay in the capital. She had been seen alive the previous evening in a cafe near Marble Arch. It was believed that she had been attacked while walking back to her lodgings alone through the blacked-out streets. The initial assessment of the Metropolitan Police was that the death of Evelyn Hamilton was a robbery that had ended in murder. The missing cash, the disordered handbag, the location of the body in a public shelter, all pointed to a crime of opportunity, the act of a thief who had encountered a lone woman in the darkness and had taken what she had. The strangulation was violent, certainly, but violence was not uncommon in robberies, particularly in the blackout, where the absence of witnesses emboldened criminals, and where the stakes of being caught were high enough to make a desperate man capable of desperate acts. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The torn clothing was noted but attributed to the struggle rather than to any predatory motive. The case was logged, the investigation was opened, and the machinery of the Metropolitan Police, already overburdened with the demands of wartime, began to turn. But it turned slowly. There were no witnesses. There were no fingerprints. There was no suspect. And there were, in wartime London, hundreds of other cases competing for the attention of detectives whose numbers had been depleted by conscription, and whose resources had been stretched thin by the sheer volume of crime that the blackout had unleashed upon the city. Evelyn Hamilton was taken to the mortuary. Her body was examined by the pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the most celebrated forensic scientist in Britain, a man whose reputation had been built on a series of famous cases stretching back to the conviction of Dr. Crippen in 1910. Spilsbury was meticulous, exacting, and possessed of a clinical detachment that allowed him to examine the most horrific injuries with the dispassionate precision of a watchmaker examining a broken mechanism. His examination of Evelyn Hamilton confirmed the cause of death as asphyxia due to manual strangulation. He noted the left-handed pattern of the bruising. He noted the absence of sexual assault. He noted the general good health of the deceased and the absence of any pre-existing condition that might have contributed to her death. His report was filed, and the investigation continued, though with little momentum and less urgency. What the police did not know, what they could not have known on that cold Sunday morning in February, was that the man who had killed Evelyn Hamilton was, at that very moment, waking in his billet at the Aircrew Receiving Centre in Regent's Park, less than a mile from the air raid shelter where her body had been found. He had returned to the centre in the early hours of the morning, slipping through the entrance without attracting attention, his name already recorded in the logbook by a fellow airman who had signed in on his behalf. He had slipped. He had risen. He had dressed in his uniform, smoothed his hair, adjusted his collar, and prepared to face the day with the calm composure of a man who had nothing to hide. The £80 he had taken from Evelyn Hamilton's handbag was in his possession. Her death was behind him. And already in the restless corridors of his mind, the anticipation of what was to come next had begun to gather like a storm. The police continued their inquiries throughout the day and into Monday morning, canvassing the streets around Montague Place, interviewing the residents of nearby boarding houses and hotels, checking the registers of shelters and hostels for anyone who might have seen Evelyn Hamilton in her final hours. The work was thorough but unproductive. The blackout had done its work. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The darkness had swallowed the crime as completely as it had swallowed the city, and the only evidence that remained was the body itself, the bruises on the throat, and the empty handbag. Meanwhile, Frederick Cherrill returned to Scotland Yard and set about the painstaking work of processing the fingerprint evidence, such as it was. The shelter on Montague Place had yielded nothing usable. The surfaces were too rough, too contaminated by the touch of dozens of hands, to provide a clear impression. The handbag had been handled by the killer, but had been white or had failed to retain a readable print. Cherrill was left with nothing but the pattern of the bruises and the knowledge that the killer was left-handed. It was not much. It was, in fact, almost nothing. But Cherrill was a patient man, trained to wait, trained to trust that the evidence would come if he was careful and methodical, and willing to let the case develop at its own pace. He did not yet know how quickly that pace would accelerate. He did not yet know that by the following morning the case would have changed entirely, that the solitary death of a pharmacist in an air raid shelter would be revealed as the first note in a symphony of violence that would grip the city for the remainder of the week. For on Monday, the 10th of February 1942, less than 24 hours after the discovery of Evelyn Hamilton's body, another woman would be found dead, and this time the crime scene would tell a very different story. Chapter 4. The Actress on Wardour Street. Wardour Street runs through the heart of Soho like a vein through a body. In 1942 it was a narrow, crowded thoroughfare lined with film offices and small restaurants, and the kinds of establishments that catered to the appetites of men on leave. Pubs and clubs and dance halls where the music played late and the drinks were poured freely and the war, for a few hours at least, could be forgotten. Soho had always been London's bohemian quarter, a district of artists and immigrants and entrepreneurs who operated at the margins of respectability, and the war had only intensified its character. The Clandstedtelpen lated in Dambum Crescent. The drinks were stronger than the rations officially permitted, and in the rooms above the shops and offices, in the small flats that lined the upper stories of the narrow buildings, women who had once earned their livings on the stage or in the factories or behind the counters of department stores, now earned them in other ways, accommodating the loneliness and the need of servicemen who had money to spend and only a few nights in which to spend it. Evelyn Oatley was 35 years old. She had been born Evelyn Nora Ward, and she was sometimes known by the name Nita Ward, one of several identities she had used over the course of a life that had taken her far from her origins. She had been married to a poultry farmer, a union that had not endured. She had come to London with ambitions of a career on the stage, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had brought thousands of young women to the West End over the generations. The promise of the footlights, the applause, the transformation from ordinary girl to something luminous and celebrated. But the stage had not been kind to her. The roles had not come, or had come too infrequently, to sustain a living. The war had closed many of the theatres. The audience had shrunk. And Evelyn Oatley, like so many others, had found herself adrift in a city that was too preoccupied with its own survival to notice one more disappointed actress. She had turned to solicitation, working the streets and pubs of Piccadilly and Soho, supplementing whatever income she could still derive from the occasional performance or bit part with the more reliable earnings of the night trade. She lived alone in the small flat on Wardour Street. She was known to the other women who worked the area. She was known to some of the servicemen who frequented the pubs. She was, in the language of the police reports, a woman of known character, a designation that said everything about the attitudes of the time, and nothing about the woman herself. On the evening of Sunday, the 9th of February, the same evening on which Evelyn Hamilton had been killed, Evelyn Oatley had been seen in the pubs and clubs of the West End. She had been drinking. She had been seen in the company of various men, servicemen mostly, the usual clientele of the blacked-out streets. At some point during the evening, she had encountered a man who was well-spoken, well-dressed, and wearing the uniform of the Royal Air Force. He was charming. He bought drinks. He made conversation with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being liked. He was, in all outward respects, precisely the kind of customer that Evelyn Oatley would have regarded as safe. A gentleman, an officer, or at least a man who carried himself as though he were one. She invited him back to her flat on Wardour Street. They walked together through the blacked-out streets of Soho, their footsteps the only sound in the darkness, the buildings around them sealed and silent behind their blackout curtains. They climbed the stairs. They entered the flat, and the door closed behind them. What happened next was reconstructed by the police and the pathologists from the evidence left at the scene, and it was, by any standard, an act of extraordinary violence. Evelyn Oatley had been strangled. The method was the same as in the Hamilton case: manual strangulation, the application of sustained pressure to the throat by a pair of strong hands. But the strangulation was not the full extent of the assault. After she was dead, or in the final moments of her dying, her throat had been cut with a razor blade. The wound was deep, running across the front of the neck, severing the major blood vessels and releasing a quantity of blood that pooled on the bed and dripped onto the floor. And then, in an act that elevated the crime from murder to something far more terrible, the body had been mutilated. A tin opener, an ordinary household implement of the kind found in any kitchen, had been used to inflict a series of wounds upon the torso and the lower body, wounds that were sexual in nature and that spoke of a depravity so extreme that the investigating officers, men who had seen death in many forms during the Blitz, were visibly shaken. A torch had also been used in the assault. The objects had been left on the bed, alongside the body, as though discarded after use, as though the killer had finished his work and simply walked away, leaving the instruments of his violence behind like tools on a workbench. The body was discovered on Monday morning, the 10th of February. A neighbour, concerned by the silence from Oatley's flat and by the non-collection of milk from the doorstep, alerted the building's caretaker. 2 meter maids who happened to be in the area were admitted to the flat and found Evelyn Oatley hanging partially over the edge of the bed, her body naked, the blood darkening on the sheets and on the floor beneath. The police were called, and this time Frederick Cherrill arrived at a scene that was very different from the barren concrete of the air raid shelter on Montague Place. The flat on Wardour Street was a closed environment, a contained space in which the killer had spent a considerable amount of time. He had touched surfaces. He had handled objects. He had left traces of himself in the room, traces that the open air of the shelter had not preserved. Cherrill moved through the flat with the slow, deliberate care of a man who understood that every surface was a potential witness. He examined the tin opener first. It was coated in blood, but beneath the blood, on the smooth metal of the handle, there were marks. Fingerprints. Clear, distinct impressions left by a hand that had gripped the implement with force. Cherrill lifted the prints with the precision that had made his reputation, using fine powder and adhesive tape to capture the whorls and ridges of the unknown hand. He found a second set of prints on a broken hand mirror that lay near the body, and when he examined both sets, comparing the patterns, noting the distinctive characteristics of each impression, he arrived at a conclusion that confirmed what the bruises on Evelyn Hamilton's throat had already suggested. The killer was left-handed. This detail, seemingly minor in the vast catalogue of horrors that the Wardour Street flat contained, was in fact of considerable forensic significance. Left-handedness occurs in approximately 10% of the population, a figure that had been broadly consistent across studies conducted in the early 20th century. A left-handed killer was not unique, but he was uncommon, and the identification of this trait immediately narrowed the field of potential suspects. Moreover, the bruising on Evelyn Hamilton's throat had indicated the same characteristic, left-handed pressure applied to the neck, the dominant hand closing around the throat from the left side. 2 women, killed within 24 hours, both strangled by a left-handed assailant. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Cherrill communicated his findings to the detective leading the Hamilton investigation, and for the first time, the possibility that the 2 deaths were connected was formally acknowledged. The flat yielded other evidence as well. The razor blade that had been used to cut Oatley's throat was found at the scene. The torch that had been used in the mutilation was recovered from the bed. Personal items belonging to the victim were accounted for, but certain objects appeared to be missing. Small valuables, a cigarette case, items of jewellery, things that a thief might take not for their monetary value but as keepsakes, trophies, mementos of the act. This detail, too, would prove significant. The taking of trophies from victims was a behaviour that investigators had encountered before, in cases where the motive was not financial gain, but something darker, something rooted in the psychology of possession and control. The killer had not merely robbed Evelyn Oatley. He had taken pieces of her with him, fragments of her life that he could hold and examine in the privacy of his own quarters, tangible reminders of what he had done. Sir Bernard Spilsbury conducted the post-mortem examination of Evelyn Oatley's body with his customary thoroughness. His report detailed the cause of death as asphyxia due to manual strangulation, with contributory factors including the throat wound inflicted by the razor blade. The mutilations were described in the clinical language of the pathologist, a language designed to strip the horror from the facts and render them as data, as observations, as points on a chart. But even Spilsbury, a man who had spent decades in the company of the violently dead, noted the severity of the injuries. The mutilations were extensive. They were deliberate. They had been inflicted with a degree of force and persistence that suggested not frenzy but purpose, not rage but ritual. The killer had taken his time. He had worked methodically. And when he was finished he had left, walking out of the flat and down the stairs and into the blacked-out street, carrying with him the trophies he had taken and the blood that must have been on his hands and his clothing, invisible in the darkness, undetectable in a city that could not see. The investigation now had a shape, though it was a shape that filled the detectives of the Metropolitan Police with dread. 2 women dead in 2 days. The same method of killing, the same left-handed grip, the same use of the blackout as cover. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a crime of passion or a domestic dispute, or any of the categories into which the vast majority of murders could be placed. This was something else. Something that the press, when they eventually learned of it, would give a name that carried with it the weight of London's darkest history. But for now, the name had not yet been spoken. For now, there were only the facts. 2 bodies. 2 crime scenes. A tin opener with a fingerprint. And somewhere in the darkness of London, a left-handed man in a blue-grey uniform, walking the streets with blood on his hands and the certainty that he would do it again. The fingerprint from the tin opener was photographed and catalogued and entered into the records of the Fingerprint Bureau at Scotland Yard. Cherrill began the laborious process of comparison, checking the unknown print against the thousands of impressions already on file, searching for a match that might give the killer a name. It was painstaking work, conducted by hand, print by print, the magnifying glass moving across the cards, the eye trained to detect the minute variations in ridge patterns that distinguished one human being from another. In 1942 there were no computers, no databases, no automated matching systems. There was only the human eye, the human brain, and the vast meticulously organized archive of paper cards that Cherrill had spent his career building. The process would take time. And time, as the next 48 hours would demonstrate, was something the City of London did not have. For the killer was not satisfied. The violence that had been unleashed in the flat on Wardour Street had not sated whatever hunger drove him. If anything, it had sharpened it, honed it to a finer edge. The first killing of Evelyn Hamilton in the shelter had been relatively restrained, a strangulation without mutilation, a taking of money without the taking of trophies. It had been, in the grim lexicon of criminal investigation, an experiment, a testing of boundaries, a first step across a threshold from which there was no return. The second killing had crossed that threshold decisively, plunging into a realm of violence so extreme that it defied ordinary comprehension. And now, with 2 killings behind him and the city still blind to his existence, the man who would be called the Blackout Ripper was preparing to step out into the darkness once more. It was Monday night. The blackout was in force. The streets were empty. And in the pubs and clubs of the West End, the women who worked the night were going about their business, unaware that among the servicemen who bought them drinks and walked them home, one had already killed twice and was looking for his next. Chapter 5. Pearl and the Housewife. Margaret Florence Lowe was 43 years old. She was named to the women who worked the streets around Tottenham Court Road by the name Pearl, a working name. The kind of small reinvention that women in her profession adopted as a matter of course. A way of separating the life lived in the daylight from the life lived after dark. She had not always been Pearl. She had been a mother. She had been a cleaner. She had been, at various points in her life, a woman who got by on whatever work was available, scrubbing floors and washing linens and doing the small invisible labours that kept the machinery of domestic life turning. But the war had narrowed her options, as it had narrowed the options of so many women in London, and she had turned to solicitation with the pragmatic resignation of a woman who understood that survival, in a city under siege, required flexibility. She lived in a small flat on Gosfield Street, a quiet turning off Tottenham Court Road in the district of Marylebone, not far from the great department stores of Oxford Street, which stood now with their windows boarded and their shelves half empty, monuments to a peacetime prosperity that felt as distant as another century. Her flat was modest. A bed, a chair, a small table, a gas ring for heating water. The walls were bare. The light, when the blackout curtains were drawn back in the morning, was thin and grey. It was the kind of place that a woman occupied rather than inhabited, a shelter rather than a home, a place to sleep and to conduct the transactions that kept the rent paid and the food on the table. On the evening of Tuesday, the 11th of February 1942, Margaret Lowe was seen on the streets of the West End. She was working. The night was cold, as all the nights of that February were cold, and the blackout had turned the streets into corridors of impenetrable darkness. She was approached at some point during the evening by a man. The details of their meeting are not recorded in the police files with the precision that a later generation of investigators might have demanded. The witnesses were few, the lighting non-existent, and the transaction itself was, by its nature, conducted in whispers and shadows. What is known is that Margaret Lowe returned to her flat on Gosfield Street in the company of a man, and that the door closed behind them, and that she was never seen alive again. The killing of Margaret Lowe followed the pattern that had been established in the flat on Wardour Street the previous night. She was strangled first, the strong left-handed grip closing around her throat, cutting off the air, the blood, the life, and then, after death had come, the mutilation began. The body was subjected to a series of injuries that were, in the words of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who would later conduct the post-mortem examination, quite dreadful. The instruments used were various: a knife, a razor blade, a candlestick, household objects taken from the flat itself and repurposed for acts of violation that the clinical language of the pathologist's report could describe but not adequately convey. The body was left on the bed, exposed, arranged with a deliberateness that suggested the killer had not merely committed an act of violence, but had composed a scene, a tableau of degradation, that was intended, perhaps, for no audience but himself. Clothing had been removed. Objects had been inserted. The wounds were extensive, methodical, and concentrated on those parts of the body that carried the greatest sexual significance. The killer had spent time in the flat. He had not hurried. He had worked with the unhurried patience of a man who knew that the darkness outside would last for hours, yet and that no one would come knocking, and that the city, wrapped in its blackout and its exhaustion, would not notice another silence behind another door. But the body of Margaret Lowe was not discovered immediately. Unlike Evelyn Oatley, whose neighbour had raised the alarm within hours, Margaret Lowe lay undiscovered in her flat for 2 days. No one came to check on her. No one noticed her absence from the streets. The milk was not collected from the doorstep, but in wartime London, where deliveries were irregular and routines disrupted, this was not, in itself, a cause for concern. It was not until the morning of Friday, the 13th of February, that the body was found, and by then the killer had already struck again. Doris Journet was 32 years old. She was, in almost every outward respect, a different kind of woman from Margaret Lowe or Evelyn Oatley. She was married. Her husband, Henri Journet, was a hotel manager, a man of respectable occupation and regular habits. The couple lived together in a ground-floor flat in Sussex Gardens, Paddington, a residential street of terraced houses that had seen better days but that retained, even in the grime and deprivation of wartime, a certain faded gentility. Doris Journet was not a woman of the streets in the conventional sense. She was not known to the police. She did not work the pubs and clubs of the West End with the professional regularity of an Evelyn Oatley or a Margaret Lowe. But she was, by the accounts that emerged after her death, a woman who was restless, bored, dissatisfied with the confines of her marriage and the monotony of wartime domestic life. She had, on occasion, sought the company of other men. Strangers met in bars or on the street, encounters that were driven not by financial necessity, but by something less easily defined, a need for excitement, for novelty, for the fleeting intensity of connection with someone unknown. In the moral vocabulary of the 1940s, she would have been described as a woman of loose character, a judgment that said more about the rigidity of the era's expectations than about the woman herself. She was young. She was lonely. Her husband worked long hours, and the war had made the old rules seem fragile, provisional, subject to revision in a world where nothing was certain and tomorrow was not guaranteed. On the evening of Wednesday, the 12th of February, Doris Journet was seen leaving her flat in Sussex Gardens. Her husband was at work. The blackout was in force. She walked into the darkness of the Paddington streets, and at some point during the evening she encountered a man. The circumstances of their meeting are unknown. Perhaps it was in a pub. Perhaps it was on the street itself, a whispered conversation in a doorway, the offer of a drink, a cigarette, a walk. What is known is that Doris Journet returned to her flat with this man, and that the flat was on the ground floor, and that the entrance was accessible from the street without the need to pass through a communal hallway or to be observed by neighbours. The privacy of the ground floor flat, a feature that under normal circumstances would have been merely convenient, became, on that night, a fatal advantage for the man who accompanied her through the door. Doris Journet was strangled with a scarf. The method was consistent with the previous killings. The left-handed grip, the sustained pressure, the systematic cutting off of air and blood until the body ceased to resist. And then, as before, the mutilation followed. Her naked body was subjected to injuries that mirrored those inflicted upon Evelyn Oatley and Margaret Lowe, the same deliberate methodical violation, the same use of improvised instruments, the same terrible patience. The killer had remained in the flat for some time after the death, arranging the scene, taking what he wanted, leaving what he did not. When he finally departed, slipping out through the ground floor entrance and into the darkness of Sussex Gardens, he left behind a body that would not be discovered until the following morning, when Henri Jouanet returned from work and found his wife dead in the home they shared. The morning of Friday, the 13th of February 1942, was the morning that the full horror of the situation became clear. Within the span of approximately 2 hours, 2 bodies were reported to the Metropolitan Police. The first was Doris Jouanet, found by her husband in their Paddington flat. The second was Margaret Lowe, found in her flat on Gosfield Street after a belated check by a concerned acquaintance. The 2 discoveries coming so close together, and both bearing the unmistakable signature of the same hand, the strangulation, the left-handed bruising, the post-mortem mutilation, the sexual nature of the injuries, forced the police to confront a reality they had been reluctant to acknowledge. This was not a series of unconnected crimes. This was not the work of different men exploiting the same darkness. This was one man, one killer, and he had taken 4 lives in the space of 4 days. The detectives of the Metropolitan Police assembled the evidence they had and laid it out. 4 women dead. Evelyn Hamilton, strangled in an air raid shelter on the 9th of February, her handbag stolen. Evelyn Oatley, strangled and mutilated in her Wardour Street flat on the 9th or 10th of February. A fingerprint recovered from a tin opener. Margaret Lowe, strangled and mutilated in her Gosfield Street flat on the 11th of February. Fingerprints recovered from a glass and other surfaces. Doris Jouanet, strangled and mutilated in her Paddington flat on the 12th of February. All 4 women had been killed at night during the blackout. All 4 had been strangled by a left-handed assailant. 3 of the 4 had been subjected to extensive post-mortem mutilation of a sexual nature. 3 of the 4 were women who were known to engage in prostitution or who had been encountered by their killer in the context of a sexual transaction. The geographic spread of the crimes, from Marylebone to Soho to Gosfield Street to Paddington, described a rough arc across the West End of London, an area that could be traversed on foot in less than an hour and that centred with an almost geometric precision on the area around Regent's Park. The investigation, which had begun as a single murder inquiry and had expanded reluctantly to encompass 2, now became the most urgent criminal investigation in wartime London. Additional detectives were assigned. The forensic evidence was consolidated under Cherrill's supervision at the Fingerprint Bureau. The pathology reports were compiled and cross-referenced. And the question that hung over every aspect of the inquiry, the question that the detectives asked one another in the corridors of Scotland Yard and in the back rooms of the police stations that served the West End, was the simplest and most terrible of all. When would he strike again? The answer, as it turned out, was that very evening. For the killer, whoever he was, had not paused to rest. He had not been deterred by the discovery of the bodies or by the increased police presence on the streets. He had not, it seemed, experienced the remorse or the satiation that might have been expected after 4 days of sustained violence. He was, on the evening of the 13th of February, back on the streets of the West End, moving through the darkness with the same confidence, the same uniform, the same polished accent, looking for the next woman who would trust him enough to walk beside him into the black. The police, for their part, were now fully alert to the danger. Officers in plain clothes were deployed to the streets of Soho and Piccadilly and Paddington, walking the same pavements as the women who worked there, watching for anything unusual, any man whose behaviour suggested predatory intent. Women police officers, dressed in civilian clothes, walked the streets as well, hoping to be approached by the unknown killer to lure him into revealing himself. The fear that had begun to spread through the West End was palpable. The women who worked the night trade, those who had not already retreated indoors, moved in pairs where they could, warned one another of the danger, watched the men who approached them with a new and urgent wariness. The press had not yet published the full details of the murders, but word had spread through the informal networks of the streets, passed from woman to woman, in whispered conversations in the backs of pubs and in the doorways of the clubs. There was a man out there. A man who killed. A man who mutilated. And the darkness, which had always been an occupational hazard, had become something far more sinister. A hiding place not for the women who used it to conduct their business, but for the man who used it to end their lives. But the darkness was vast, and the streets were many, and the police, for all their urgency, could not be everywhere at once. And in the pubs of Piccadilly, where the lights were low and the drinks were strong and the conversation was easy, A man in the uniform of the Royal Air Force was sitting at a bar, buying a round, smiling at the woman beside him, and preparing to do it again. Chapter 6. The Press and the Panic. The morning of Friday, the 13th of February 1942, marked the moment at which the case ceased to be a matter for the police alone, and became a matter for the public. The discovery of two bodies within hours of each other, the bodies of Margaret Lowe and Doris Joannette, both bearing the same terrible marks of strangulation and mutilation, had forced the Metropolitan Police to acknowledge that a serial killer was operating in the heart of London, and though the police had no desire to publicise the fact, fearing the panic it would cause in a city already under siege, the press had begun to gather the threads of the story. The newspapers of wartime Britain operated under severe constraints. Newsprint was rationed. The physical size of the papers had been reduced, and the government, through the machinery of the Ministry of Information and the voluntary censorship agreements that govern the relationship between the press and the state, exercised considerable influence over what was published and how it was framed. The overriding priority was the maintenance of public morale. The news from the front was bad. Singapore was falling to the Japanese. The German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping in the Atlantic at a catastrophic rate. The Eastern Front was a charnel house of unimaginable proportions. The British public, already weary after 2.5 years of war, did not need to be told that their own capital harboured a murderer who was killing women at the rate of 1 per day, and yet the story could not be entirely suppressed. The reporters who covered the police courts and the magistrates' hearings in the mortuaries of London had their own sources, their own contacts within the police, and by the morning of the 13th of February, enough of the details had leaked to make publication inevitable. The first reports were cautious, hedged with qualifications, stripped of the more lurid details. The newspapers spoke of a series of murders in the West End, of women found dead in their homes, of a possible connection between the crimes. They did not initially describe the mutilations. They did not publish the names of all the victims. They were careful, as the government wished them to be, to avoid the kind of sensationalism that might provoke mass panic or undermine the collective resolve that was understood to be essential to the war effort. But even the most restrained reporting could not disguise the essential horror of the situation. 4 women dead in 4 days. A killer at large. And the police, by their own admission, had no suspect. It was in this atmosphere of controlled disclosure and mounting unease that the name emerged, the Blackout Ripper. It appeared first in the evening papers, attributed to no single journalist but arising, as such names often do, from the collective imagination of a press that understood the power of a phrase to crystallize a complex and frightening reality into something sharp and memorable. The name was a deliberate echo of the most infamous murderer in London's history, Jack the Ripper, who had stalked the streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, killing and mutilating women in a series of crimes that had never been solved. The parallels were obvious and were immediately drawn by the press and the public alike. Both killers targeted women who engaged in prostitution. Both killers mutilated their victims' bodies. Both killers operated in darkness, in the narrow streets and alleys of London, exploiting the cover provided by the absence of light. And both killers had, for the duration of their crimes, eluded the efforts of the Metropolitan Police to catch them. The comparison was not entirely fair to the police of 1942, who were operating under conditions that their Victorian predecessors could not have imagined. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 had taken place in a single, densely populated district of the East End, an area that could be flooded with officers and sealed off with relative ease. The Blackout Ripper was operating across a much wider area, from Marylebone to Soho to Paddington, in a city that was physically darkened, chronically understaffed, and simultaneously dealing with the demands of wartime policing. The enforcement of blackout regulations, the management of air raid shelters, the investigation of looting, the processing of deserters, and the 1,000 other tasks that fell upon a police force that had lost a substantial proportion of its manpower to military conscription. The comparison with Jack the Ripper was nonetheless irresistible, and the press made the most of it. The name Blackout Ripper appeared in the Liverpool Daily Post, the Bolton News, the Hull Daily Mail, the Evening Telegraph, and the Evening Standard, among others. The Bolton News ran a headline asking whether a killer was at large in London. The Evening Telegraph spoke of a wave of London murders. The coverage was not confined to the domestic press. International periodicals picked up the story, and the parallels with the Ripper murders of 1888 were drawn in newspapers from New York to Sydney. The story had a narrative force that transcended the usual boundaries of wartime censorship. It was not merely a crime story. It was a story about the vulnerability of a great city, about the unintended consequences of the blackout, about the dark spaces that war had opened up in the fabric of civilian life. It was a story that asked uncomfortable questions about the price of safety, about the trade-offs that had been made in the name of national defence, about the women who had been left exposed and unprotected in the darkness that was supposed to shield the city from its enemies. The effect on London's population was immediate and significant. Women who worked the streets of the West End, who had until now accepted the risks of the blackout as an unavoidable feature of their occupation, began to withdraw. The regular workers of Piccadilly and Soho, those who had walked the streets every night for months or years, stayed indoors. The pubs and clubs that had served as meeting places for servicemen and the women who accompanied them reported a sharp decline in female patronage. The fear was not confined to women who engaged in prostitution. The details that had emerged, the strangulation, the mutilation, the apparent randomness of the attacks, suggested a killer who was not discriminating in his choice of victims. Evelyn Hamilton had been a pharmacist, not a woman of the streets. Doris Duanet had been a married woman, a housewife. Any woman, it seemed, who found herself alone in the darkness of the blackout was a potential target, and in wartime London, where women worked night shifts in factories and hospitals and offices, where they walked alone to and from bus stops and train stations, where the darkness was not a choice but a condition imposed upon them by the necessities of war, this realization was profoundly alarming. The police responded to the mounting pressure with a visible increase in their presence on the streets. Additional officers were drafted in from surrounding divisions. Plainclothes detectives were deployed to the pubs and clubs of the West End. Women police officers, as Frederick Cherrill would later note in his autobiography, walked the darkened streets in civilian clothes, hoping to be approached by the killer. The strategy was bold but fraught with risk. The officers were operating in near total darkness. Their ability to observe and respond was severely limited by the same blackout that shielded the killer, and the resources available to them, even with the reinforcements, were insufficient to cover the vast area over which the crimes had been committed. The West End of London was not a single street or a single neighbourhood. It was a sprawling district of interconnected roads and alleys and squares, of pubs and clubs and hotels and boarding houses, of doorways and shelters and staircases, and the countless other spaces in which a man and a woman might disappear from view. To patrol it all, to watch every corner and every entrance, would have required a force many times larger than the one the Metropolitan Police could muster. The killer, if he chose to strike again, would find no shortage of dark places in which to do so. Behind the scenes the investigation was progressing, though not as quickly as the detectives would have wished. The fingerprint evidence recovered from the Wardour Street flat and from the Gosfield Street flat was being processed by Cherrill and his team at the Bureau. The prints from the tin opener at the Oakley scene and the prints from the glass at the Low scene had been compared and found to be consistent. The same left hand, the same ridge patterns, the same individual. The killer was one man. This much was confirmed. But the prints did not match any impression in the Bureau's existing records, which meant that the killer had no prior criminal record, or at least none that had resulted in his fingerprints being taken and catalogued. He was, in the language of the system, an unknown, a man who had never before come to the attention of the police. This was, in one sense, a dead end. The fingerprint, which in other circumstances might have led directly to a name and an address, led instead to a blank, a space in the records where no file existed. But in another sense, it was a vital piece of evidence, a signature that the killer had left behind and that could be used to identify him with absolute certainty if he was ever found. The prints were unique. They belonged to one man, and one man only. And if that man was ever brought before the police, if his fingers were ever pressed into ink and rolled across a card, the match would be instantaneous and irrefutable. The press, meanwhile, continued to push the story. The government's preference for restraint was increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of a public that was frightened and demanding answers. The questions being asked in the streets and in the pubs and in the shelters were simple and direct. Who was doing this? Why had he not been caught? Was it safe for women to go out at night? And the answers, when they came from the authorities, were unsatisfying. The investigation was ongoing. The police were doing everything in their power. The public was urged to remain calm and to report any suspicious behaviour. These were the standard reassurances of an institution under pressure, and they did little to quell the anxiety that was spreading through the city like smoke through a bombed-out building. What the public did not know What the police themselves did not yet fully understand was that the crisis was about to resolve itself, and that it would be resolved not by the slow, methodical work of the Fingerprint Bureau, not by the officers walking the streets in plain clothes, not by the women police decoys or the increased patrols, but by a single, careless mistake made by the killer himself, a mistake so elementary, brushstroked, almost impossible that a megalynch negredig. It would seem, in retrospect, almost impossible that a man capable of such negligence, that it had divided it theights. But that is the nature of these cases. The same darkness that conceals the crime also conceals the criminal from himself, allowing him to believe that he is invisible, untouchable, beyond the reach of consequence. And it was this belief, this fatal overconfidence, that would bring the Blackout Ripper down, not in the course of a long and painstaking investigation, but in the space of a single evening on a darkened street near Piccadilly Circus, where a young woman screamed and a delivery boy came running and a gas mask was left behind in a doorway. Chapter 7. The Deliverance of Greta Hayward. The evening of Friday, the 13th of February 1942, was cold and dark and indistinguishable to the casual observer from any other evening of that long and punishing winter. The blackout was in force, as it was every night. The streets of the West End were wrapped in their customary darkness, the buildings sealed behind their curtains, the lamps extinguished, the traffic reduced to a slow crawl of hooded headlights, and the occasional flash of a warden's torch. The city moved by feel, by memory, by the practiced instinct of a population that had learnt to navigate its own streets in the dark. The pubs were open. The clubs were open. The servicemen on leave were drinking and smoking and talking, the usual rituals of men who had been given a few hours away from the war and intended to make the most of them. And among them, in a bar or a club or a pub in the vicinity of Piccadilly Circus, Gordon Frederick Cummins was preparing to hunt again. He had killed 4 women in 4 days. He had strangled Evelyn Hamilton in an air raid shelter and taken her money. He had strangled Evelyn Oakley in her Soho flat and mutilated her body with a tin opener and a razor blade. He had strangled Margaret Lowe in her Gosfield Street flat and violated her corpse with a knife, a blade and a candlestick. He had strangled Doris Joanet in her Paddington flat with a scarf and mutilated her in the manner that had now become his signature. He'd returned to his billet at the Aircrew Receiving Centre after each killing, his name signed into the logbook by a compliant comrade, his uniform cleaned or changed, his demeanour unaltered. He had attended his assessments during the day, participated in the routine of the centre, spoken to his fellow airmen with the same polished accent and the same easy confidence that had always been his camouflage. No one suspected him. No one had reason to. He was the Count, the Duke, the man with the invented pedigree and the charming manner, an object of mild amusement, but not of alarm. And now, on the evening of the 13th, with the bodies of Margaret Lowe and Doris Joanet discovered only hours earlier, and the press already beginning to use the name Blackout Ripper, he was back on the streets, the darkness around him, the uniform on his back, the hunger still unsatisfied. The Universelle Brasserie in Piccadilly Circus was the kind of establishment that thrived in wartime London. It served food and drink at prices that servicemen could afford. It was busy, crowded, noisy, a place where the solitude of the blacked-out streets gave way to the warmth and the light and the companionship of a bar full of people who were all, in their own ways, trying to forget that there was a war on. It was here, on the evening of the 13th of February, that Cummins encountered a young married woman named Margaret Hayward, though some accounts would later refer to her as Greta Hayward. She was drinking alone, or had been until Cummins sat down beside her and introduced himself. He bought her a drink. He was charming, attentive, well-spoken. He wore the uniform of the Royal Air Force. He was, to all appearances, a gentleman, a man of breeding and education who happened to be in uniform. The kind of man a woman might feel safe with in a city that had become, in recent days, a very unsafe place to be. The two talked for some time. Cummins suggested they move to the London Trocadero, a nearby restaurant and entertainment venue, for a drink and a sandwich. Hayward agreed. They left the brasserie together and walked through the darkened streets toward Haymarket. The conversation continued. Cummins was solicitous, attentive, the practiced performer playing the role he had perfected over years of reinvention, but as they walked his manner began to change. He became, in Hayward's later description, unpleasantly forward. His hand moved to her waist. His grip tightened. His voice, which had been warm and conversational, took on a different quality, an insistence, a pressure that had not been there before. And then, without warning, he pushed her into a doorway. The doorway was dark, as all doorways were dark in the blackout. The street was empty, or appeared to be. Cummins's hands were on her throat. The grip was sudden and fierce, the left hand leading, the fingers closing around the neck with a force that was not a caress and not a threat, but an act, the beginning of the same sequence that had ended the lives of 4 women in the preceding days. Haywood struggled. She fought. She twisted against his grip and tried to cry out, her voice strangled by the pressure on her throat, but not entirely silenced. The sound carried through the darkness of the street, a thin, desperate noise, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the city, but audible enough. John Shine was 18 years old. He was a delivery boy, making his rounds in the early hours of the morning, carrying whatever goods needed to be transported through the blacked-out streets on behalf of his employer. He was young, slight, and unarmed. He was not looking for trouble. He was simply doing his job, moving through the darkness with the practiced efficiency of a young man who knew the streets well enough to navigate them by memory. But he heard the sound. A commotion. A struggle. The unmistakable noise of a woman in distress. And he did what many men, old and stronger than himself, might not have done. He turned toward the sound. He moved quickly. He entered the doorway. The arrival of John Shine was enough. Cummins released his grip on Haywood's throat and fled. He ran from the doorway and into the darkness of the street, his footsteps receding rapidly into the black. Haywood, bruised and shaken but alive, collapsed against the wall of the doorway, gasping for air, her hands at her throat where the marks of his fingers were already beginning to darken into bruises. Shine knelt beside her. He asked if she was hurt. He helped her to her feet. And then, as the immediate danger receded and the adrenaline began to ebb, he noticed something on the ground of the doorway. The man who had fled, the man who had been trying to strangle this woman in the dark, had left something behind. It was a gas mask. An RAF-issued gas mask, in its standard-issue carrying case, the kind of item that every serviceman was required to carry at all times. And on the inside of the carrying case, stenciled in clear, regulation lettering, was a number. A service number. 525-97. The significance of this detail cannot be overstated. In the entire history of the Blackout Ripper case, in the long catalogue of forensic evidence and pathological examinations and witness statements and fingerprint comparisons, it was this single object, this gas mask left behind in a doorway near Piccadilly Circus by a man who was in too great a hurry to remember to take it with him, that broke the case. The gas mask was not a fingerprint, which required weeks of comparison to match. It was not a witness description, which could be vague and contradictory. It was a serial number, a unique identifier linked directly to a name in the records of the Royal Air Force, and it could be traced in a matter of hours. Shine helped Haywood to the West End Central Police Station, where she provided a statement and where Shine handed the gas mask and the haversack to the investigating officers. He explained that he had recovered the items from the doorway where he had found Haywood under attack, and Haywood confirmed that the items had been in the possession of her assailant. A detective sergeant named Thomas Shepherd examined the carrying case and noted the service number printed on the inside. He immediately contacted the Royal Air Force Police, who in turn contacted the Aircrew Receiving Centre at Regent's Park. The inquiry was straightforward. The service number 525-95 was entered into the records. The records returned a name. Leading Aircraftman Gordon Frederick Cummins. The staff sergeant at the receiving centre confirmed the identification. The gas mask and haversack had been issued to Cummins. And Cummins, the staff sergeant added, was not currently at his billet. His name had been signed into the logbook, but Cummins himself was absent. The information was relayed to Shepherd at 11:30 in the evening. Shepherd instructed the centre to detain Cummins when he returned, but the night was not yet over, and Cummins, driven by whatever compulsion had sustained him through 4 days of killing, was not yet finished. Sometime after the attack on Haywood on the same evening, Cummins encountered another woman. Her name was Catherine Mulcahy, though she was also known as Kathleen King. She was a woman who worked the streets near Paddington railway station, and she was, on that night, engaged in her usual occupation when she was approached by a man in RAF uniform. She accompanied him, or he accompanied her, to her flat, and there, in the darkness of the flat, he attempted to strangle her. But Catherine Mulcahy fought back. She was strong, or desperate, or both. She kicked. She screamed. She clawed at the hands around her throat and made enough noise to alarm whoever might be within earshot. Cummins, perhaps shaken by the interruption of his earlier attack on Haywood, perhaps unnerved by the ferocity of Mulcahy's resistance, released his grip. He reached into his pocket and gave her £5, a payment or a bribe, or simply the reflexive gesture of a man who, even in the extremity of his violence, could not entirely abandon the persona of the gentleman. And then he fled, again into the darkness, leaving behind on this occasion his RAF issued belt. 2 attacks in a single evening. 2 women who survived. 2 pieces of evidence left behind, the gas mask with the service number and the belt. The carelessness was astonishing, and it spoke to a disintegration that had been accelerating throughout the week. The first killing of Evelyn Hamilton had been relatively controlled, a strangulation without mutilation, a robbery without the taking of trophies. Each subsequent killing had been more violent, more prolonged, more reckless. Mutilations had escalated. The time spent at the crime scenes had increased. And now, on the 5th night, the killer was attacking 2 women in rapid succession, fleeing from both, leaving behind identifying evidence at both scenes. The escalation was complete. The spiral that had begun with the strangling of a pharmacist in an air raid shelter had reached its terminus in a doorway near Piccadilly Circus, where an 18-year-old delivery boy had interrupted a murder in progress, and a gas mask had fallen to the ground like a calling card left by fate itself. Cummins returned to the receiving centre in the early hours of the 14th of February. It was Valentine's Day, though the irony would have been lost on everyone involved. He attempted to enter the billet quietly, slipping through the entrance with the practiced stealth of a man who had done this many times before. But this time, the police were waiting. He was detained. He was taken to West End Central Police Station. He was charged initially with the assault on Margaret Haywood. The charge was common assault, a holding charge, a way of keeping him in custody while the investigation continued. But even as the charge was being read, the detectives were already looking beyond it, already connecting the service number on the gas mask to the fingerprints on the tin opener, already understanding that the man standing before them, this polished, well-spoken airman with the affected accent and the calm demeanour, was the Blackout Ripper. A search of Cummins's quarters at the receiving centre was authorised and carried out, and there, in his locker and among his personal effects, the detectives found what they were looking for. A fountain pen that had belonged to one of the victims, a cigarette case initialed with letters that did not match his own, a comb. Small personal objects, items of no great monetary value but of immense evidentiary significance, trophies taken from the women he had killed, kept close, hidden among his belongings like relics in a shrine. The objects were catalogued, photographed and matched to the victims from whom they had been taken. The forensic net was closing, and at the centre of it, calm and composed and still insisting upon his innocence, stood Gordon Frederick Cummins, the Count, the Duke, the Honourable Pretender, the man who had killed 4 women in 4 days, and who would have killed more if an 18-year-old boy with a delivery round had not heard a scream in the dark and had the courage to walk toward it. Chapter 8. The Fingerprint Man. Frederick Rupert Cherrill was born on the 18th of September 1892 in a cottage in Malthouse Row, in the village of Dorchester-on-Thames, in Berkshire. He was the 6th of 9 children born to George Edward Cherrill, a carpenter, and his wife Emma Ann, born Crook. There was nothing in this humble origin, in this crowded cottage in a small English village, that would have suggested the extraordinary career that lay ahead. He was not the son of a policeman or a magistrate or a man of law. He was the son of a man who worked with his hands, who shaped wood into useful forms, who understood the grain and the texture and the resistance of physical material. And perhaps it was this inheritance, this intimacy with the tangible world, that prepared Frederick Cherrill for the work that would define his life, the reading of fingerprints, those infinitely delicate patterns pressed into the surfaces of the world by the ridges of human skin, each one unique, each one a signature, as individual and as irrefutable as a face. Cherrill had joined the Metropolitan Police as a young man and had risen through the ranks with the steady, methodical persistence that characterized everything he did. He was not a flamboyant figure. He did not seek the public attention that attached itself to some of his more celebrated colleagues. He was quiet, precise, and possessed of a patience that was, in his profession, more valuable than brilliance. He had been drawn to the Fingerprint Bureau early in his career, recognizing in the emerging science of dactyloscopy a tool of extraordinary power, a means of identification that did not depend on the fallible memories of witnesses or the subjective judgments of investigators, but on the objective, measurable, unchanging patterns of the human hand. He had studied the work of the pioneers, Sir Edward Henry, who had developed the classification system used by Scotland Yard, and Sir Francis Galton, who had established the statistical uniqueness of fingerprints, and he had built upon their foundations with a dedication that was, over the decades, nothing short of monumental. By 1938, when Cherrill was appointed head of the Fingerprint Bureau at Scotland Yard, the Bureau held thousands of catalogued impressions, each one filed and cross-referenced in a system of paper cards that occupied an entire floor of the building. The system was entirely manual. There were no machines, no electronic databases, no automated comparison tools. Every match was made by the human eye, the trained observer comparing the halls and loops and arches of an unknown print against the catalogued impressions on the cards, searching for the distinctive characteristics, the minutiae, the tiny variations in ridge endings and bifurcations and dots that distinguished one print from another. It was work that required extraordinary concentration, extraordinary patience, and an extraordinary memory for pattern and detail, and it was work at which Cherrill excelled. His particular genius, the skill that set him apart from other fingerprint examiners, was his ability to identify single prints at a crime scene. In the early decades of the 20th century, the conventional wisdom held that a useful identification required a full set of prints, all 10 fingers, rolled in ink and pressed onto a card. Cherrill had demonstrated through years of careful work and courtroom testimony that a single print, a single impression left by a single finger on a single surface, was sufficient to establish identity beyond reasonable doubt, provided the examiner possessed the skill and the experience to read it correctly. It was this skill that Cherrill brought to the Blackout Ripper case, and it was this skill that would, in the end, seal Gordon Cummins's fate. The fingerprint recovered from the tin opener in Evelyn Oatley's flat on Wardour Street was the cornerstone of the forensic case. It was a clear impression, left by the thumb of the left hand, pressed into the smooth metal of the handle with sufficient force to leave a readable pattern. Cherrill had lifted the print with powder and adhesive tape, a technique he had refined over decades of practice, and had photographed it at high magnification, capturing every ridge and valley and bifurcation in detail that the naked eye could not perceive. He had then compared the print to those recovered from the broken hand mirror at the same scene, and to the prints recovered from a glass in Margaret Lowe's flat on Gosfield Street, and had confirmed that all 3 impressions belonged to the same individual, the same left hand, the same thumb, the same unique arrangement of ridges that existed on no other hand in the world. When Gordon Cummins was arrested in the early hours of the 14th of February and brought to West End Central Police Station, his fingerprints were taken as a matter of routine. The ink was applied. The fingers were rolled across the card. The impressions were recorded, catalogued, and sent to the Fingerprint Bureau for comparison. And there, in the quiet of the Bureau, under the magnifying glass of the man who had spent his career reading the invisible traces of human contact, the match was made. The thumbprint on the tin opener was Gordon Cummins's. The prints on the mirror were his. The prints on the glass in Margaret Lowe's flat were his. The identification was absolute. It was not a matter of probability or statistical likelihood. It was a certainty, as certain as the laws of physics, as unambiguous as a signature written in ink. Gordon Cummins had been in Evelyn Oatley's flat. He had handled the tin opener that had been used to mutilate her body. He had touched the mirror that lay beside her on the bed. And he had been in Margaret Lowe's flat, where he had held a glass from which he had drunk while the woman he would later strangle and mutilate was still alive. But the forensic case did not rest on fingerprints alone. The gas mask that Cummins had left behind in the doorway near Piccadilly Circus, the gas mask with the service number 525 late 7, was examined by Carrot 108 and 2nd, was examined by Cherrill and his colleague Detective Sidney Birch. Inside the respirator, they found traces of mortar dust and brick debris. The composition of this debris was analysed and compared to samples taken from the air raid shelter on Montague Place where Evelyn Hamilton's body had been found. Match was consistent. The dust inside Cummins's gas mask was forensically similar to the material found at the scene of the first murder. This meant that the gas mask had been present in the shelter, that it had been worn or carried by someone who had been in close physical proximity to the concrete and brick of the shelter's interior. It was not in itself conclusive proof that Cummins had killed Evelyn Hamilton, but it was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence that placed him at the scene. The personal effects recovered from Cummins's quarters at the receiving centre added further weight to the case. The fountain pen was identified as the property of Doris Joannet. The cigarette case bore the initials of one of the other victims. Additional items, small and personal, were matched to the women who had been killed. These were not the proceeds of robbery in the conventional sense. They were trophies, keepsakes taken from the dead and the dying, objects that carried with them the memory of the act, tangible fragments of the violence that the killer could hold and examine in private, reliving the experience at will. The taking of trophies was a behavior well documented in cases of serial violence, and its presence in this case further confirmed the nature of the crimes. These were not opportunistic attacks motivated by financial gain. These were acts of predation, planned and executed by a man who derived satisfaction not merely from the killing itself, but from the possession of its aftermath. The detectives who interrogated Cummins at West End Central found him calm, composed, and entirely uncooperative. He denied everything. He denied knowing any of the victims. He denied having been present at any of the crime scenes. He denied that the gas mask was his, suggesting, with an insouciance that bordered on contempt, that any of the 300 airmen billeted at the receiving centre might have taken his gas mask and used it. He denied that the personal effects found in his quarters belonged to the dead women, or if they did, he suggested they had been placed there by someone else, planted by an unknown party for reasons he could not explain. His manner was polished, controlled, almost theatrical, the performance of a man who had spent his entire adult life playing a role, and who was not about to abandon the performance simply because the audience had changed. He was the Honourable Gordon Cummins, and he was innocent, and the evidence, however overwhelming, was simply wrong. The police were not persuaded. The evidence was, as Cummins himself would later acknowledge in a letter to his wife, overwhelming. The fingerprints were irrefutable. The gas mask was his. The trophies were in his possession. The left-handed bruising on the victims' throats matched his dominant hand. The timeline of the murders corresponded precisely with the period of his posting to the receiving centre, and the geographic distribution of the crimes mapped onto the area surrounding Regent's Park, within easy walking distance of his billet. Everything pointed to Cummins. Everything converged upon him with the inexorable logic of a case that was, from the moment the gas mask was recovered from the doorway near Piccadilly Circus, effectively closed. The investigation continued nonetheless, with the thoroughness that the gravity of the case demanded. Additional witnesses were interviewed. The women who had survived Cummins's attacks, Margaret Hayward and Catherine Mulcahy, provided detailed statements describing their assailants, and their descriptions matched Cummins in physical appearance, manner, and dress. The pawnbrokers of the West End were canvassed, and evidence emerged that Cummins had pawned items of jewellery and other valuables that could be traced to the victims. The logbook at the receiving centre was examined, and the practice of having comrades sign in for absent airmen was documented, demolishing Cummins' alibi. Fellow servicemen were questioned and confirmed that Cummins had been absent from his billet on the nights in question, despite his name appearing in the log. The case was airtight. The evidence was comprehensive. And Frederick Cherrill, the fingerprint man, the quiet, patient, methodical son of a Berkshire carpenter, had provided the keystone that held it all together. Cherrill's role in the case would be tested one final time in the most public and adversarial arena available, the courtroom of the Old Bailey, for it was there, in the wood-panelled chamber where the most serious criminal cases in England were tried, that the fingerprint evidence would be challenged, scrutinised, and subjected to the full force of cross-examination. And it was there that Cherrill would be required to stand before a jury and explain in terms that laymen could understand how the invisible traces left by a human thumb on a blood-stained tin opener could identify, with absolute certainty, the man who had held it. The law demanded proof beyond reasonable doubt. The defence would argue that doubt existed, and it would fall to Frederick Cherrill, with his magnifying glass and his quiet conviction and his decades of experience, to demonstrate that it did not. But that reckoning was still weeks away. For now, in the cold days of mid-February 1942, the immediate priority was the formal charging of Gordon Cummins and the preparation of the case for trial. The decision was made after consultation between the Metropolitan Police and the Director of Public Prosecutions to charge Cummins with the murder of one victim only, Evelyn Oakley. This was a strategic decision, dictated by the strength of the evidence in that particular case and by the legal convention that a defendant should be tried for a single offence when the evidence for that offence was sufficient to secure a conviction and a capital sentence. The fingerprint on the tin opener, the fingerprints on the mirror, the evidence of mutilation, the testimony of the pathologist, the identification of trophies, all of these pointed to Cummins with a clarity that left no room for reasonable doubt. The charges relating to the other 3 murders of Evelyn Hamilton, Margaret Lowe and Doris Duanet would remain on file, to be brought forward if necessary, but held in reserve for the present. The case of Evelyn Oatley would be tried first, and if the jury found Cummins guilty, the sentence would be death, and the other charges would become, in practical terms, moot. Cummins was formally charged and remanded in custody. He was held at Brixton Prison to await trial, and it was there, in the narrow confines of a prison cell, stripped of his uniform and his affected accent, and the persona he had constructed over years of patient fabrication, that Gordon Frederick Cummins sat and waited for the machinery of justice to reach him. The Count was in custody. The Duke was behind bars. And the Blackout Ripper, the name that the press had given to the shadow that had terrorized the West End for 6 terrible days, had a face at last. Chapter 9. The Trial at the Old Bailey. The Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, known to the world as the Old Bailey, stands at the corner of Newgate Street and Old Bailey in the City of London, a stone's throw from the ruins of the old Newgate prison, where condemned men and women had once waited for the hangman. The building itself, completed in 1907, is a monument to the solemnity of English justice, its Portland stone facade crowned by the bronze figure of Lady Justice, who stands above the entrance with her sword in one hand and her scales in the other, her eyes, contrary to popular belief, uncovered, watching the city below with an unwavering gaze. It was here, in Court No. 1, the most famous courtroom in England, that the trial of Gordon Frederick Cummins for the murder of Evelyn Oatley was scheduled to begin on the 24th of April 1942. The courtroom was packed. The public gallery was full, its seats occupied by those who had queued for hours in the hope of witnessing the trial of the man the press had called the Blackout Ripper. The press benches were crowded with reporters from the national and international newspapers, their notebooks open, their pencils sharpened, ready to record the proceedings for an audience that extended far beyond the walls of the court. The case had attracted enormous public attention, not merely because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of the context in which they had been committed, the wartime blackout, the vulnerability of the victims, the failure of the darkness to protect the city from a predator who wore its own uniform. The trial was, in the minds of many who attended it, not merely the trial of a single man, but a reckoning with the unintended consequences of the war itself, a confrontation with the dark spaces that the blackout had opened up in the life of the capital. The prosecution was led by counsel who presented the case with the methodical precision that the evidence demanded. The case against Cummins rested on 3 pillars. The first was the fingerprint evidence, the prints recovered from the tin opener and the broken mirror in Evelyn Oatley's flat, which Cherrill had identified as belonging to Cummins. The second was the testimony of the surviving victims, Margaret Haywood and Catherine Mulcahy, whose descriptions of their attacker matched Cummins and whose accounts of the assaults were consistent with the methods used in the murders. The third was the physical evidence recovered from Cummins's quarters at the receiving centre, the personal effects belonging to the victims, the items that had been taken as trophies and concealed among his belongings. But the trial did not begin smoothly. On the first day of proceedings, the 24th of April, an error was made in the presentation of the evidence. An incorrect exhibit was shown to the jury, a mistake that, while minor in substance, was sufficient to compromise the integrity of the proceedings in the eyes of the judge. The defence raised an objection. The judge, recognising that the error had potentially prejudiced the jury, took the extraordinary step of dismissing the jury entirely and ordering that the trial be restarted with a new panel of jurors. The proceedings were adjourned. A new jury was empanelled, and the trial began again 3 days later, on the 27th of April, with the same charges, the same evidence, and the same defendant, but with a fresh jury that had not been exposed to the tainted exhibit. The defence of Gordon Cummins was undertaken by a barrister named Mr. J. Flowers, who had replaced the original defence counsel, Dennis Nowell Pritt, the King's Counsel and Member of Parliament for Hammersmith North, after the aborted first trial. The defence strategy was narrow and focused almost entirely on a single objective, the discrediting of the fingerprint evidence. If the fingerprints could be called into question, if doubt could be introduced into the jury's mind regarding the reliability of the identification, then the case against Cummins would be significantly weakened. The personal effects found in his quarters could be explained away, the defence would argue, as items that had been planted or that had come into his possession through innocent means. The testimony of the surviving victims could be challenged on the grounds of identification made in near total darkness. But the fingerprints, if accepted, were conclusive. They placed Cummins in the room where Evelyn Oakley had been killed. They placed his hand on the instrument that had been used to mutilate her body. And no amount of argument could explain away that fact unless the fingerprints themselves could be shown to be unreliable. Frederick Cherrill took the witness stand and delivered his testimony with the calm authority of a man who had spent decades defending the science of fingerprint identification in courtrooms across the country. He explained the principles of dactyloscopy to the jury, the uniqueness of fingerprint patterns, the impossibility of two individuals sharing the same arrangement of ridges, the methods by which prints were lifted from surfaces and compared to known impressions. He presented the enlarged photographs of the prints recovered from the tin opener and the mirror, placing them side by side with the prints taken from Cummins at the time of his arrest. He pointed to the matching characteristics, the ridge endings, the bifurcations, the distinctive patterns that were identical in both sets of impressions. He stated, with the quiet certainty that was his hallmark, that the prints on the tin opener were the prints of Gordon Frederick Cummins, and that this identification was, in his professional opinion, beyond any possibility of error. The defense challenged Cherrill fiercely. The cross-examination was prolonged and detailed, probing every aspect of the fingerprint evidence, questioning the methods of recovery, the conditions at the crime scene, the reliability of the comparison process. Cherrill was asked whether it was possible that the prints had been contaminated. He said it was not. He was asked whether the prints could have been left at a time other than the night of the murder. He acknowledged that fingerprints could not be precisely dated, but noted that the prints were found on an object that was directly associated with the crime, an object that had been used to inflict the injuries that caused the victim's death. He was asked whether another person could have prints sufficiently similar to Cummins's to produce a false match. He stated categorically that this was not possible, that the probability of two individuals sharing the same fingerprint pattern was, for all practical purposes, 0. He stood his ground throughout the cross-examination, answering each question with the measured patience of a man who had heard every challenge before, and who knew, with the certainty of decades of experience, that his evidence was sound. On the second day of the retrial, Cummins made the decision to enter the witness box and give evidence in his own defense. It was a gamble, and it was a gamble that failed spectacularly. Under cross-examination by the prosecution, Cummins's composure, the polished veneer that had sustained him through years of deception, began to crack. He was asked about the gas mask found in the doorway near Piccadilly Circus. He maintained that it was not his, or that it might have been taken from the receiving centre by another airman. He was asked about the personal effects found in his quarters. He offered no credible explanation. He was asked about his movements on the nights of the murders. His answers were vague, contradictory, and, on several points, demonstrably false. The prosecution pressed him on specific details, dates and times and locations, and Cummins, trapped between the need to deny his presence at the crime scenes and the difficulty of constructing a coherent alternative narrative, made admissions that damaged his case. He admitted that he had lied to the police during his initial interrogation. He admitted that the logbook at the receiving centre was not a reliable record of his movements. He admitted that he had been absent from his billet on nights that corresponded to the murders. The admissions were extracted slowly, methodically, each one a small fracture in the wall of denial that Cummins had built around himself, and by the time the prosecution had finished, the wall was in ruins. The jury retired to consider its verdict. The deliberation lasted 35 minutes. When the foreman rose to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell silent, that particular silence of a room full of people holding their breath, waiting for the single word that would determine whether a man lived or died. The word was spoken. Guilty. Gordon Frederick Cummins was guilty of the murder of Evelyn Oakley. The judge, having received the verdict, pronounced the sentence. The sentence was death. Death by hanging, to be carried out at a time and place determined by the authorities. Cummins received the sentence without visible emotion. He stood in the dock, straight-backed, composed, the mask of the gentleman still in place, even now, even at the end, even as the words that condemned him to the gallows echoed through the wood-panelled chamber of the Old Bailey. An appeal was lodged in early June of 1942. The grounds of the appeal were narrow, focusing on procedural matters and on the question of whether the fingerprint evidence had been presented in a manner that was fair to the defendant. The appeal was heard and dismissed. The Court of Criminal Appeal found no grounds for overturning the conviction. The evidence, the court determined, had been properly presented and properly evaluated by the jury. The verdict was sound. The sentence stood. While Cummins awaited execution, he wrote a letter to his wife Marjorie. The contents of this letter have been preserved and quoted in various accounts of the case. In it, Cummins made a statement that would become one of the most discussed and debated aspects of the case. He wrote words to the effect that although he did not know, he thought he must be guilty because the evidence was overwhelming. The statement is remarkable for its ambiguity. It is not a confession. It is not a denial. It is something in between, a suggestion, perhaps, that the man who had killed 4 women in 4 days did not fully understand his own actions, that the violence had been committed in some state of altered consciousness, a fugue or a blackout from which he had emerged with blood on his hands, and no memory of how it had got there. Whether this claim was genuine or merely a final, desperate attempt to mitigate his guilt is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What is certain is that the letter was the closest Gordon Frederick Cummins ever came to acknowledging what he had done. His family, led by his wife, mounted a campaign for a reprieve. Letters were written to the Home Secretary. Appeals were made to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who lent his voice to the plea for clemency. The grounds for the reprieve were humanitarian rather than legal, an argument that the sentence of death was disproportionate, that Cummins was not in full possession of his faculties, that the war had damaged him in ways that the court had not considered. The campaign was unsuccessful. The Home Secretary declined to intervene. The sentence of death was confirmed, and the date of execution was set for the 25th of June, 1942. Chapter 10. The Last Air Raid. The morning of the 25th of June, 1942, came to Wandsworth Prison, the way all mornings came to that grim Victorian institution. Slowly, grudgingly, the grey London light seeping through the narrow windows of the cell blocks and falling in thin, reluctant bands across the stone floors. The prison stood in the south of the city, a massive structure of dark brick and iron gates, built in 1851 to house the capital's convicted criminals, and it had served that purpose without interruption for nearly a century. Its walls had witnessed hangings beyond count. Its corridors had echoed with the footsteps of condemned men walking their last walk. From the cell to the scaffold, the distance measured not in yards, but in heartbeats. And on this morning, it was Gordon Frederick Cummins who would make that walk. He had been held in the condemned cell for several weeks, a small room separated from the main prison population, watched at all hours by warders who sat with him in shifts, ensuring that he did not harm himself before the state could carry out the sentence that the court had imposed. The routine of the condemned cell was Spartan and unwavering. Meals were brought at regular intervals. A chaplain visited daily. The prisoner was allowed to write letters, to receive visits from family, to read, to sit, to wait. The waiting was, by all accounts, the worst of it, the slow, relentless accumulation of hours and days between the pronouncement of the sentence and the moment of its execution, a period in which the condemned man knew, with absolute certainty, the date and the manner of his death, and could do nothing but watch the time pass, each tick of the clock bringing him closer to the trapdoor and the rope. Contemporary accounts of Cummins's final hours suggest that he maintained his composure until very near the end. He had spent his life performing, playing the part of the gentleman, the aristocrat, the man of breeding and distinction, and the performance did not cease simply because the audience had changed, and the stage had shrunk to the dimensions of a prison cell. He dressed carefully. He combed his hair. He wrote a final letter to Marjorie, the wife who had believed in him, or had wanted to believe in him, and who had fought for his reprieve with a devotion that the circumstances did not diminish. The contents of that final letter have been preserved in the archives of the London Metropolitan Archives, a document written in a steady hand on the morning of a man's death, the last words of a killer to the woman who had loved him. The executioner who had been appointed to carry out the sentence was Albert Pierrepoint, a name that would become synonymous with the practice of judicial hanging in Britain during the middle decades of the 20th century. Pierrepoint was 37 years old in the summer of 1942, a publican from Lancashire who had followed his father and his uncle into the profession of hangman, a trade that was, in the peculiar nomenclature of the British Civil Service, classified as a part-time appointment. He was meticulous, efficient, and utterly professional. He had studied the techniques of execution with the seriousness that another man might have brought to the study of medicine or law. He knew the calculations that determined the length of the drop, the complex interplay of body weight and rope length, and the position of the knot that, if executed correctly, would produce instantaneous death through the fracture and dislocation of the cervical vertebrae. He had carried out numerous executions before Cummins and would carry out many more after him, including, in the years that followed the war, the executions of Nazi war criminals convicted at the Nuremberg and Hamburg trials. He approached each execution with the same calm detachment, the same attention to detail, the same commitment to ensuring that the process was carried out swiftly, humanely, and without error. On the morning of the 25th of June, Pierrepoint arrived at Wandsworth Prison and made his preparations. The scaffold was inspected. The rope was tested. The trapdoor mechanism was checked and rechecked. The length of the drop was calculated based on Cummins's height and weight, measured during a discreet observation conducted the previous day. Everything was ready. The process from the moment the condemned man left his cell to the moment the trapdoor opened was designed to take no more than a few seconds. Pierrepoint believed, as a matter of professional principle, that speed was a mercy, that the condemned man should have as little time as possible to contemplate what was happening, that the transition from life to death should be swift and clean, and insofar as it was possible, painless. Cummins was given a glass of brandy to calm his nerves. It was a small concession, a final gesture of ordinary human decency in a process that was otherwise devoid of comfort. He drank it. He rose from his chair. He was flanked by 2 warders, one on each side, who walked with him from the condemned cell through the short corridor that led to the execution chamber. The distance was brief. The door was opened. The scaffold was before him. The beam and the rope and the trapdoor. The simple, brutal machinery of death that had not changed in its essentials for centuries. Cummins walked to the mark on the trapdoor without resistance. He did not struggle. He did not cry out. He did not collapse or plead or attempt to flee. He stood on the trapdoor and allowed the white hood to be placed over his head, the cloth falling over his face and blocking out the last light he would ever see. The noose was positioned around his neck, the knot placed beneath the left ear, in the position that Pierrepoint's calculations had determined would produce the cleanest break, and then the lever was pulled. The drop was instantaneous. The trapdoor opened beneath Cummins's feet and his body fell through the gap, the rope snapping taut, the force of the fall transmitting through the fibre in the knot and into the bones of his neck. Death was immediate. The entire process, from the moment Cummins left the condemned cell to the moment the trapdoor opened, had taken less than 2 minutes. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. Gordon Frederick Cummins was 28 years old, and then, in one of those coincidences that seem too precise to be accidental but that are in truth nothing more than the indifferent workings of chance, the air raid sirens began to wail. The sound rose from the streets of South London, that familiar, terrible rising and falling note that had been the soundtrack of the Blitz, the warning that German bombers were approaching, that the city was once again under attack, that the darkness from above was reaching down to claim whatever it could find. The prison staff, who had been standing in silence around the scaffold, reacted with the practiced efficiency of men and women who had lived through years of bombing. The body of Gordon Cummins, as per the custom of judicial execution in Britain, was required to hang for 1 hour after death before being taken down. But the air raid changed the calculus. The body was removed from the noose earlier than protocol demanded and placed upon a stretcher as the sirens continued to sound and the prison prepared for the possibility of a strike. Cummins was carried from the execution chamber and placed in the designated area within the prison grounds, where he would later be buried in an unmarked grave, as was the custom for executed prisoners. The air raid passed. The bombers came and went. The all clear sounded, and the prison returned to its routine. Gordon Frederick Cummins became in that moment the only convicted murderer in British criminal history known to have been executed during an air raid. The man who had used the darkness of the Blackout to murder and mutilate 4 women, who had exploited the chaos of the German bombing campaign as cover for his own private campaign of violence, died as the bombs fell one last time, the war that had given him his opportunity reaching into the execution chamber itself, to mark his passing with the sound of its own destruction. The symmetry was terrible and complete. He had killed in the dark. He died as the darkness returned. The charges relating to the murders of Evelyn Hamilton, Margaret Lowe and Doris Juanetz remained on file. Cummins had been convicted and executed for the murder of Evelyn Oakley alone, the case in which the fingerprint evidence was strongest and the forensic chain most complete. Scotland Yard investigators stated in the months and years that followed that they were satisfied Cummins had murdered all 4 women, and that they believed he was also responsible for the deaths of 2 women in London in October of 1941, Maple Churchyard, aged 19, strangled with her own undergarments, and the woman known only as Mrs. Church, killed under similar circumstances 4 days later. If these suspicions were correct, then Gordon Cummins's total of victims numbered 6, not 4, and his career as a killer had begun not in the freezing February of 1942, but in the autumn of the previous year, when the Blitz was still raging and the darkness was at its deepest. The victims were buried. The investigation was closed. The files were sealed. And the City of London, which had endured the bombing and the blackout and the terror of a killer in its midst, turned its attention back to the war, which was far from over and which would continue, with its own vast and impersonal violence, for another 3 years. The Blackout Ripper passed from the headlines and into the footnotes of history, overshadowed by the enormity of the conflict that had made his crimes possible. The government, which had never been comfortable with the publicity the case had attracted, discouraged further reporting. The wartime censorship that had restrained the press during the murders continued to operate after the execution, and the story faded from public consciousness with a speed that was, in its own way, as disturbing as the crimes themselves. The women who had died, Evelyn Hamilton, Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, Doris Juanet, were remembered by those who had known them and forgotten by those who had not. Their names did not appear on war memorials. Their deaths were not counted among the casualties of the Blitz. They had been killed not by the enemy but by one of their own, a man in the uniform of a defender, and the nation, in its grief and its exhaustion, had no room for their particular sorrow. Margaret Hayward and Catherine Mulcahy, the 2 women who survived, carried the marks of their encounters with Cummins for the rest of their lives. The bruises on their throats faded. The nightmares did not. They had looked into the face of the man who had killed 4 women, had felt his hands on their throats, had come within seconds of joining the dead. And they had survived. One because an 18-year-old delivery boy had heard a scream in the dark and had walked toward it, and the other because she had fought with a ferocity that had overwhelmed her attacker's nerve. John Shine, the delivery boy whose intervention had saved Margaret Hayward's life and had led directly to the identification and arrest of the Blackout Ripper, returned to his work and to his life, carrying with him the knowledge that he had, on a dark night in February, done something extraordinary, something that most men, faced with the same circumstances, might not have had the courage to do. Frederick Cherrill, the fingerprint man, continued his work at Scotland Yard until his retirement, his reputation enhanced by the Blackout Ripper case, and by the many other cases in which his expertise had proven decisive. He wrote an autobiography, published under the title Careless of the Yard, in which he recounted, among many other cases, his involvement in the Cummins investigation. The book is now out of print, a relic of a vanished era of policing, but its pages contain the quiet testimony of a man who understood, better than most, the power of the invisible traces that human beings leave upon the world. Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the pathologist whose examinations had documented the injuries inflicted upon the victims, continued his work as well, though the toll of decades spent in the company of the violently dead was beginning to tell. He would take his own life in December of 1947, alone in his laboratory at University College London, the accumulated weight of a career spent cataloguing the worst that human beings could do to one another, finally proving too heavy to bear, and London endured. The blackout continued until the 17th of September 1944, when the government, confident at last that the threat of German bombing had been effectively neutralised, issued the order to stand down the regulations. The street lamps were lit. The curtains were drawn back. The painted windows were scraped clean. And the city, for the first time in 5 years, allowed itself to be seen, its battered streets and its ruined buildings and its weary, resilient people bathed once more in the ordinary, miraculous light of a civilization that had survived the darkness and had, at last, emerged from the other side. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent. The streets of London returned to the light, one lamp at a time, and the shadows that had sheltered the Blackout Ripper dissolved into the grey morning air. The women were not forgotten, though the world moved on without them, and history once again turned the page in the dark